checkered gabardine overcoat still held the morning dew as David shook it and hung it up on the rail just inside the foyer to the old stone mansard home at the end of the lane. It had hung on the garden post as nightfall set in and rolled on toward dawn, making itself visible through the lens of steaming coffee as the man of the house peered out onto the fresh soil of the garden plot, a spade at the ready to uproot vegetables when needed. At precisely 9 a.m., as the chime struck on the mantel clock, the doorbell rang and his spoon fell to the floor. It was a hasty opening, a meticulous turn of the knob yet rushed. "Good morning, sir. Are you David Morehouse?" The taller of the two rather drab-looking gentlemen stood on the entry stoop, looking more past him than at him. "Yes, sir, I am. What can I do for you?" "I am Lieutenant Detective Simpson, and this is my partner, Detective Segerson." He nodded almost imperceptibly at the shorter man to his rear. "Might we come in? We are looking into a matter concerning Lydia Morehouse. She is your wife, is she not?" Surprise fitted itself upon his face, and with animated purpose David invited the gentleman into the parlor, offering refreshments once seated. Both men were strictly to business, declining the offer, and instead proceeded with their inquiry. "Mr. Morehouse, when did you last see your wife?" the lieutenant detective asked while his wandering eyes took in the scenery and decor of the room. "I suppose it was last weekend, Saturday morning to be precise. She was off to visit her family up in Hiram. Her mother lives on the old farm and is not altogether well, it seems." "What is this about, detective?" Both detectives glanced at each other before the lead continued, ignoring his question. "I see. We understand you run a firm down on Congress Street. Equities, investments, is it?" David merely nodded, but took note of the readiness of his inquisitors. "So, have you talked with her since she left?" "No. She prefers it that way when she's up country. She understands how I feel about much of her family and likewise." "Again, what is this about?" "Do you know Philip Bergman?" the short detective asked abruptly. The senior man seemed a bit annoyed with the cut-in but said nothing. "I've heard the name, but I don't think I've ever been formally introduced to him. You might want to talk with the lady next door. I believe she used to be a Bergman. Rosalind's her name, Rosalind Sanders. That's her family name, but I'm sure she used to be a Bergman." Maybe out of nervous habit or unconscious deflection, David inadvertently glanced toward the back of the house where the doorway to the garden ground was still open to the fresh air. "Given the circumstances, Mr. Morehouse, we suspect other than innocent occurrences may be at play here. We contacted your wife's family and they never heard anything from her, nothing since her previous visit last month. You can understand our concern, I am sure." David stared at the two men momentarily. "Do you suspect this Philip Bergman fellow as having something to do with Lydia's absence?" Lieutenant Detective Simpson looked directly at David as he told him they did not have enough information at this time to make that determination. "Did Mrs. Morehouse know Philip Bergman as far as you are aware?" Maybe it was a peak of angst over an undesirable circumstance showing on his brow or deep in his eyes. He was sure the detectives picked up on it, but he said nothing and just shook his head. "We will want to search the house and grounds, Mr. Morehouse. Standard procedure, you know." "What? Surely I am not a suspect in this matter." The detectives looked at him and brushed decorum aside. "We can secure the warrant if necessary, sir. I will want my counsel in that case." David excused himself to his study and placed his calls before returning to the parlor and informed the detectives that his counsel was speedily on his way and they would need a warrant to proceed. The two men just looked at each other, and the senior fellow excused himself to the front stoop where he made his request for a warrant. Half an hour later, two more policemen arrived along with David's counsel, and the search and investigation continued. A fortnight previously, Lydia Morehouse sat perched on the wicker recliner positioned on Rosalind Sanders' sun porch, watching the couple consume themselves in sheer lust. "Jesus, that is hot." Philip groaned as he sat up and admired his conquests. Both women rose up and retreated into the kitchen before returning with robes and drinks. Philip had already slipped his trunks on and had queued up his theme, Back in Black, and was well into his rather obnoxious peacock strut when they seated themselves. Rosalind just rolled her eyes at the spectacle and turned to Lydia. "Do you still think we can pull it off?" she asked her neighbor as the woman leered lustily at her ex-husband. "If I didn't, we wouldn't be here. Besides, David is nothing but putty when it comes to me. If he had half the charisma Philip is swinging around, I'd keep him." Lydia replied as she dropped onto her hands and knees and made her way over to Philip. Rosalind watched the two of them, her ex taking full advantage of the woman from next door. It was his plan originally to seduce her and screw her senseless, or so he thought. That was one of his few talents. He could have sex all night. Outside of that, he was just worthless, but Lydia wanted him. She liked it. "Once we have the money," Philip will take care of the rest," Lydia said to Rosalind as Philip rubbed his hands in glee. "6 million you said, right? Three-way split?" Lydia looked at him and nodded approvingly. She wasn't always so calculating and wanton. There were the good years, she remembered, but it grew into something unsatisfying. Somewhere there was greener grass, bigger rings, newer models. David was staid, so predictable. So boring. Then there was Philip. Philip with his everlasting stamina and his revelry switched set to eternity. He told her he'd kill for her, and she had a climax. Perhaps the sodden path began many years earlier up in Hiram, where her mother parked an old weather-beaten Airstream off behind the shed at her family's overgrown farm. Lydia and her sister shared pull-down bunks as her mother entertained a variety of flotsam on the other end, often sending the sisters to play in the barn until her pleasures were sated. There was an endless stream of men in and out of their lives, and eventually even into the intimate confines of both the girls, continuing until Lydia ran away before graduating out of high school. She measured herself against the picked-over misery her mother and family offered, and chose an escape accompanied by a promise to become somebody, anybody but who she was living in that tin can. Yet in the end, the apple stares up at the branch it fell from. Rosalind looked in studied silence until she whispered, "I want to watch him kill him." For whatever odd reason, the three of them thought that to be the funniest thing as they laughed in unison. The lieutenant detective stood looking at the fresh soil of the garden, rubbing his brow deep in thought. He had already probed the loose soil with a rod and found nothing. Still, there was something about it that wouldn't settle in his mind. The soil was sandier and much lighter than the darker soil around it. It was out of place. "You've been working in your garden a lot, Mr. Morehouse?" he asked. "Yes, I've been building the beds, thinking of a good row of greens to put in for next autumn." Still, it remained unsettled. The detectives and the other members of the search team combed through the house and basement, as well as the grounds, and later gathered in front of the house in animated conversation. David stood watching them along with his counsel. "It's standard procedure, David. I would not be concerned at this point, but we certainly need to sit down and go over the events of the day and take precautionary measures." The police remained in the front yard for a considerable time, as some of the neighbors congregated at the mailboxes wondering over all the excitement. Rosalind Sanders' home remained unobtrusively quiet, as if vacant and uninterested. Not even a stir at the curtains. It was the buzz of his phone in the pocket that broke David's stare. "It's done," the message on text stated. Nothing more needed to be said. The two detectives strode down the walk and approached Rosalind's house, ringing the bell and knocking several times on the heavy oak door facing the street without results. They peered into the bushes and even one of the windows before walking around toward the backside. Segerson stooped down and picked something up near the back door to the sun porch. "I've found something you need to take a look at," he yelled out to his senior. With gloved hands, the lead detective held the evidence up to the light and examined it closely before whistling to the other police still on site next door, and they came scurrying to the backside of the Sanders home. Of course, they deliberated for several moments until the better of them turned the doorknob and entered the unsecured abode. David's Esquire had settled into an easy chair in the study and reviewed notes as his client observed the happenings next door. Before long, another car arrived and 2 more officers entered the scene. Another 15 minutes passed, and a burst of activity excited the neighborhood. Another police car arrived, followed by an EMT vehicle, and they all entered the house next door. For several minutes, officers came and went scurrying between the front door and the backyard. Clearly, they found something, the counsel exclaimed as they watched the EMTs enter the front door with a gurney. Nearly an hour later, they exited with multiple black plastic bags secured on top of the gurney and the 2 investigating detectives following. As the gurney was loaded into the vehicle, Lieutenant Detective Simpson and Detective Segerson returned to the Morehouse residence. "Mr. Morehouse, counsel, we'd like your client to come down to the station house so we can take a proper statement," Simpson said, looking at the attorney. "There is no need for that. My client will have nothing to say that hasn't already been said. Anything you might want to ask can be done right here, but again, he has nothing to state at this point. If you are going to Mirandize my client, please do so now. You know we can take him in and hold him." The shorter detective piped up while his senior scowled at him. "And I'll have a writ before you can fix your coffee. In the meantime, if you have completed your search, let's wrap things up, shall we? We realize the warrant will entitle you to return if you choose, but I will insist on my presence if you do, as is my client's right." Both detectives were none too pleased at being dismissed so readily, but they knew as well as the counsel there was no choice if Morehouse was not willing. A writ of habeas corpus would have him free before sundown, especially with the Esquire's well-known connections. Still, Simpson pondered over gnawing thoughts. The fresh soil continued to provoke an interest, and there was something else. The home was modestly furnished in outward appearances, yet each piece, the choice of accent pieces, spoke refinement and wealth. The marble tray next to the divan was not a box store knockoff. The wealth was subtle, almost deliberately masked in simplicity. After years of this police work, one thing the man knew. Money is always a potential motivating factor to take into account in suspicious circumstances. And now the circumstances, at least next door, were more than suspicious. Body parts and a greater mystery would consume the detective's time at this point, and certainly there would be a return visit to the Morehouse residence. There was not just the body parts, but the mystery of who made the call and concerns that brought them out here in the first place. Lydia gazed at the specimen before her through eyes heavily lidded from the black hashish that Philip had crumbled up earlier. "Why did you bring him into the mix, Philip?" Rosalind asked while nodding at the man lying back on the bed. "None of your damn business, except I needed him. Besides, I'm paying him, not you." Lydia just shrugged. Whatever it takes to do it right. It was Wednesday afternoon, and the four of them were upstairs in the master bedroom of Rosalind's home making their final plans. "Are you going to gut him?" Rosalind asked her ex, almost salivating from the excitement the question posed. Lydia looked at her and contemplated her sick perversity. They were never originally going to kill David, instead planning on transferring the money and traveling to South America somewhere, maybe Uruguay. That was fine until they realized that only Lydia had a passport and Philip had outstanding warrants on him, and Rosalind was only interested in smoking dope and having sex and didn't care where. Lydia decided they would part company when it was over. Both of them were stupid people in any event. The best of plans never mesh well with stupidity and dope-addled minds. In this case, sex and dope were just a substitute for planning, and before they could formulate a coherent strategy, one or all of them were on their backs being ravaged by the other. It was a blood-simple mindset. Rosalind and Philip suggested killing him and disposing of the body, giving cause to think David had run off with the funds. Lydia shrugged and went along with it when it was suggested. Maybe it was the opium-laced hashish that did the thinking for her. In any event, they were here now and 2 days away from carrying out their dark scheme. "What do you mean, am I going to gut him? It's not a damn thrill kill, you stupid witch." Philip sneered. Rosalind just pulled on her cigarette and blew smoke in his direction. Lydia pondered the past several days' activity. It had been easy to get the passwords, far easier than she thought. They were in David's little black book right there in the front drawer. When it was done, she would have to erase her tracks, but she couldn't do that until the transactions were complete several minutes after the transfers. That was her end of the deal. Philip and Rosalind would take care of David, and they would meet back here at the house. It was a simple plan. By early evening, the police had left the scene next door except for a sole police cruiser parked at the curb and a night duty officer to stand watch from the front seat. Pouring himself a cup of tea in the kitchen, David pulled a biscuit out of the bread box and fastened it with a piece of ham, throwing a wayward scrap to the black-haired cat at his feet. The smallest of smiles crossed his lips as he thought back on the day. The senior detective was subtle enough, too much so for his own good, while the junior man was merely a mechanic of sorts going through the motions of police work while anticipating a donut's reward. The audacity to suspect him of complicity, the chutzpah of direct action in the face of nothing. Thank God the Esquire was quick to the punch, and they left empty, otherwise he'd still be entertaining their fancy even at the late hour, he thought to himself as he readied for bed. Morning came quick and David was off to his offices to assist in a routine audit of banking transactions and account activity. While he managed a very profitable portfolio, the office staff was lean and efficient, 3 employees to assist in managing accounts, along with an office manager to handle backroom activities. "Mr. Morehouse, I think we have a problem." The wiry and stern-looking lady spoke to him somewhat overbearingly loud over a midday break. A series of very large transfers were made, or rather were attempted, and all but one of them was stopped by controls. "What are you talking about, Ms. Allen?" he said as the other employees glanced up. "What I mean is that several client accounts were set up for bank transfers last Friday afternoon, and they were prevented by the account controls we have in place here in the office, all except your personal account. That saw a transfer of $1.6 million. All to one Cayman Islands account set up by your wife, and it appears that account has since been emptied by subsequent transfers." A couple hours later, David's counsel, one of the bank's directors, an auditor, an FBI special agent, and the 2 now familiar detectives were gathered in the office conference room discussing the new revelations. Lydia Morehouse had apparently gained access to the investment accounts and had attempted to abscond with nearly $18 million, and having been unable to do so transferred only her husband's balance of $1.6 million. "Morehouse, you could have done this yourself." Detective C. Gerson spoke before his senior could act. The lieutenant detective just rolled his eyes and shook his head. Why in hell would I do that? I'm sitting right here, and it's my money that is missing, not somebody else's. David replied with indignation as his counsel held his arm to keep the peace. Mr. Morehouse, why would it take this long to discover the apparent theft? Simpson asked. I know I had not made any transactions Friday afternoon, and with Monday a holiday, I had not been in the office until today. I had client appointments on Tuesday and yesterday. Well, you know where I was. We do our account audits every Thursday. We are not a large operation. Simpson thought over the man's response and eventually settled on an agreement of sorts. It would make little sense for him to orchestrate a theft of his own monies, and as the managing director of his firm, bypassing controls would have been his prerogative. It would seem at this point that all the evidence points toward the wife's complicity. The chime of his phone broke him from his study, and several minutes later he returned to his partner and David. It seems Mrs. Morehouse's car was found in the long-term lot at the Manchester airport earlier this morning, and we are just being notified through the state police. I would say she would be the most likely person of interest and suspect at this point. And the body found next door to Mr. Morehouse's residence? David's counsel inquired. Identified as the remains of Philip Bergman earlier today, and the remains of a second male victim whose identity is unknown. Simpson replied stone-faced. Not a pretty task at all. As for Rosalind Sanders, we have no idea where she is at the present. I'm not going to make too many assumptions here, but Ms. Sanders and Mrs. Morehouse could be involved together in this, or the two crimes may be completely separate occurrences. We just don't know until all of the evidence is processed by the state lab. Mr. Morehouse, I'm going to ask that you make yourself available for further inquiries if needed, and we will probably want to take a fresh look around both properties. The federal folks will be handling the wire fraud matters from this point on. David and his counsel agreed, of course, and the detectives gathered their materials while two FBI agents set up a processing center in the office boardroom. They had already traced the original wire and identified 6 transfers out of the Cayman accounts, each destined to another offshore account and at this point untraceable. By the time the afternoon was concluded, Lydia Morehouse was a wanted suspect in 8 federal counts of wire fraud and embezzlement. Rosalind Sanders remained a person of interest in both the homicides in her home and as a potential accomplice in Lydia's crimes. Lydia made the evening news as David poured himself bourbon and threw a scrap at the cat. Seeing her picture on the screen was unsettling and satisfying. Unsettled in the sense of there being so many open questions, and satisfying to know he wasn't the suspect in these nefarious doings. Lydia could have done it. Maybe not 10 years ago when they first met, but now, yes, she could have done all these things. It seemed like yesterday, to quote the cliché, but it was a reasonable truism. Lydia was a regular bar patron down at the Montrose, a sipping club for the shirts and ties off Congress Street in the business district. She was a couple steps up from hooker and a ladder rung or two below lady, yet she was well-mannered and held her drink well. She was also the best David had ever had by far, and between being intoxicated by body and her particular charming wit, the two of them were soon fast company. Lydia Morehouse was a beautiful woman in a rush-odd manner, maybe 5 feet 6 inches in stocking feet, with full hips and lips always at the ready for a pout or smile. She tried going blonde for a while, but it detracted from her naturally fierce good looks. With smoky dark brown eyes, almond in appearance, and a sultry countenance, David was easily seduced. The two of them parlayed a quick romance into a profitable marriage, and as the business succeeded, the accoutrements of comfort found their way into most aspects of their relationship. After a few years, the smoky allure settled and they moved through life much as many other couples. A day here and a week there, and then a repeat of the same. While David was satisfied with much of his lot, Lydia yearned for something else, perhaps the attention she enjoyed while perched like a reward back in the Montrose days. In time she found it between the sheets of a downtown hotel bedroom with a suite of paramours, each with their own satisfying talents and limitations. Eventually the dope found her and depravity set its unlimited toehold. Rosalind Sanders moved in next door, and soon Lydia was a regular fixture while her husband tended to his business. Dark-haired and sharing a promiscuous proclivity for sex and drugs, Rosalind fed Lydia's sense of adventure with afternoon trysts to an assortment of watering holes and pickup joints down in the Port City's waterfront district. The depravity continued with a growing dependence on the thrill or the chase in the next line or smoke. The next sex session in whatever room could be had on short notice. Rosalind sold dope when she could or peddled in the business hotels, never convincing Lydia to follow suit. Lydia was smarter than Rosalind, way smarter when dope didn't addle her mind. Then Philip began coming around supplying more drugs for Rosalind to peddle. The two of them were married once, but she divorced him when he got sent to jail a few years earlier, yet They continued an on and off relationship after he was paroled. He got sent back in for another year, and it was after that when he started dropping in while Lydia was around. Within a week, he was screwing both women. One of the pratfalls of depravity is that it hangs on the face like a mask, not in an outward appearance, although there is that as well in some. It affects one's character and actions, desires and interests, and to the studied mind it becomes apparent. For all her intentions and expectations of discretion, Lydia couldn't hide it once it consumed her. The occasional afternoon sordid affair with the insurance manager next door to David's business was one thing. The drug-infused orgy with Rosalind, Philip, and a couple of other men was another matter altogether. She craved whatever endorphins the experience released, and from that point was lost. It was the depravity that David saw, and he took out his own measure of justice. Lighting a cigarette, Lydia looked over at Rosalind. They had been having sex in the upstairs bedroom most of the morning, and now it was past noon with work ahead of them. I have to run the job after 3 p.m. That's when David closes the account files and has his staff meeting before calling it quits. He will get home sometime around 7 p.m. Make it quick and no more shit talk, Rosalind. Philip, you hear me? No crazy shit. Just do it right, like we talked. Now let's get cleaned up. I need to run to the house. Lydia looked back at the two of them, wondering when the Mexican was going to show up. He was part of Philip's plan, not hers, and as long as it worked as planned, she didn't give a care one way or the other. She had already decided this was the last time she'd see any one of them. She picked up her bag, walked back to her home, and grabbed a quick shower. The airline ticket lay on the end table as Lydia pulled up the accounts. Getting the passwords had been particularly easy. David had used the same passwords he used for his home computer. She remembered thinking what a dumbass he was for making it so easy, that and keeping them in a damn notebook in the drawer. 20 minutes later, the transfers would run, and she would grab the tickets and get the hell out of there. Several minutes later, the jobs began running, and before she could congratulate herself, a system prompt jumped up asking for the admin password needed to make the transfer. She tried the same password to no avail until she reached the last transaction, moving David's funds from his personal account. The transaction completed, and $1.6 million was transferred to a Cayman Islands account. Lydia sat cursing the computer and her husband and pounding the table until she sat back and lit a cigarette. Screw it. It's better than nothing. She loaded a couple bags into her car, and then going for her heirloom box down in the basement, she walked down the stairs. Mr. Morehouse, why is the soil in that row so much sandier and lighter than the rest of the garden plot? Simpson inquired while running his fingers through the loose soil. I had a couple yards of it piled back here that I picked up when they were tearing down a property across town. Fellow told me I could have it, so I loaded a couple pickup trucks. It's better for drainage than the stuff already there. David answered quickly. Interesting. When they returned to the house, David offered the police officer refreshments, and this time he accepted. I see you are a lover of books, Mr. Morehouse. Yeats, Hawthorne, Welty, Poe, Chekhov, Eliot, Melville, that's quite a collection. Yes, I have been an avid reader since childhood. I much prefer a good book to the television any day. I'm a Stephen King fan myself. Oh, he's good for his genre, but I wouldn't put him up against Poe even on his best day. David said, proudly running his fingers over the spine of a first edition collection of the author's short stories. I've never read him. Like I said, I love King and that CIA spook author there. What's his name? Clancy? I love that Clancy fellow. The detective replied before moving on to the case matter before him. The FBI had taken David's laptop into evidence and couldn't find Lydia's, assuming she disappeared with it. Nothing incriminating was found on David's, so they were prepared to return it in a matter of days. The state police let us know that you can reclaim your wife's car when you are of a mind to. There was nothing of note in it. The terminal didn't have any record of her flying out on a ticket, at least under her own name, nor was there any record of Rosalind Sanders, or her former name Bergman either. Some are thinking the car was just a diversion, and they may be right. In any event, we'll have to see what pops up. Usually the perp makes a mistake and a transaction can be traced. We'll see in good time. What about the second victim? Do you know who it was? David asked. At this point, no. We took prints as best we could, but nothing came up in our system. Might have been an illegal as he was a Hispanic male. The detective wrapped up his business and returned to the house next door for a while before driving off. David watched from the parlor living room while sipping his tea. Being just a short walk off Congress Street, the Morehouse residence was an easy residential stroll to the bustling commercial district. In the 1920s, it was home to a somewhat nefarious fellow from Boston with connections to Old Ireland and the rougher working-class fellows of England's industrial Birmingham. He had started refurbishing the 19th-century postbellum residence in 1919 after returning from the Great War rather unscathed, and then the advent of 1920 changed all manner of things. In 1921, Liam McCovey was running cases of Irish whiskey into a small alcove near Lubeck, and his men were driving it down to Portland to sell in half a dozen speakeasies. The rest of the load went down into Boston to raise cash for the IRA back on the Green Isle. It wasn't long before the local police, with the help of federal cops, were raiding obscure warehouses around the city and putting a dent in both the supply and the moral freedom of McCovey's men. In the middle of refurbishing his home, McCovey took action to restore his business and discretion. With careful excavations after dark, an underground stone hallway opening up into a large chamber room had been built with an adjoining tunnel to the residence next door, a home occupied by another disreputable fellow of similar inclinations. With patient craftsmanship, both ends had been fitted with secret passageways built behind what to the naked eye would be solid granite walls in the cellars of each home. The chamber had been deadened with baffling to keep the sounds of activity from prying ears. It served its purpose well in the Prohibition years, and many cases of whiskey and other contraband had passed into its hallways until repeal came and put an end to its use. During the war years in the 1940s, the owners considered it a refuge should the Germans take Portland, a silly proposition, but it was readily available if needed. After that, it was merely a novelty and succumbed to memory before it was forgotten with the passing of generations. It was an old ledger book and binder found buried in the far attic that shed light on the innovation again, and David Morehouse toyed with his secret playroom like a kid in a candy store until it found a new purpose, one nefarious in design and fitting for the circumstances. The far end of the tunnel had been blocked off and backfilled with sandy loam for privacy concerns, but at one time it opened into the granite cellar of the Sanders house next door. Lydia's eyes were adjusting to the dim light in the chamber, trying to ascertain her whereabouts for the countless time. Walls of granite block and the slate tiles nestled in the sandy soil at her feet offered no clue other than the granite being similar to that in her own cellar and 1,000 others in town. An old tile water cistern sat in the corner of the chamber, collecting runoff from an obscure hidden source. "Comfortable?" a faintly familiar voice asked from the recesses of the darkened hallway. Without her full senses in order, Lydia couldn't determine whose voice called out to her. It just sounded familiar yet distant. The drops of water falling into the cistern distracted her like a cacophonous dull strike of a hammer against a flat surface, concurringly deafening and still. Who are you? Where am I?" she answered back in knowing futility. There was no answer. The shadowy figure just stood there watching from his concealment. The metal shackles at her ankles were a reminder of her captivity, and she waited in vain for an answer. A moment later, and he was gone, leaving her to the source of the single light and the symphony playing off the walls of the cistern. A sharp clang of a door closing against its frame surrendered the chamber to its solitude. Fear stalked her sensibilities, and irrationality fueled every thought. She had no idea how long she had been kept in her condition. It seemed like hours, but had actually been a couple days. A small burlap bag had contained several tins of canned fish and biscuits, enough to sustain her over her short captivity, but barely so. The shackles kept her within the chamber, its chain anchored to a small mooring in the center of the room, with a waste pot sitting next to an opening in the floor that led to wherever it flowed. A bucket of water from the cistern able to flush its contents. Lydia could peer into the dark tunnel leading to the Sanders house, but couldn't venture down it. All she could do at this point was scream and scream. She did, until hoarse from the futile efforts. There is little point in that. It merely disturbs the rats. A voice spoke from the tunnel. It was clearer now, and she recognized it. Falling back startled at the revelation, "David," was all she could say as her eyes went white with fear. He entered into the chamber with his wife, trembling in the corner, shocked at the appearance. He wore canvas overalls with a leather butcher's apron, both smeared with blood, yellow kitchen gloves, and in his hands were 2 severed heads. Philip Bergman and his Mexican co-conspirator, with their dead eyes staring at the woman in the corner. She tried to scream, but there was nothing left to hear. "Well, a fine hello to you too." He chuckled while setting the heads on the wooden table before him, keeping the lifeless eyes upon their cowering accomplice. "For better or worse, Lydia," he said. "What? For what?" she replied without comprehension. "For better or worse. That's what we agreed to. I'm keeping my end of the bargain, dear. The worse it is. I don't know. I'm sure you don't, darling, but you should. It was in your vows and in mine, and here we are living it out in bliss. I'm keeping my vows, Lydia, just like I promised. I'll take care of you to the end, either yours or mine." The poor woman ran an assortment of tales through her head. "They made me do it. I was never going to go through with it. I was only going along until we could do them in. Honey, I was never going to kill you." Eventually, she just stared at her husband in miserable defeat. Her clothing was filthy, her hair matted, and the nicotine and other drug withdrawals only feeding a growing anxiety and nervous reaction to her condition. "I have further work to do, dear. I'll be back in the evening," David said as he gathered a severed head in each hand and turned toward the tunnel. David sat in the dusty attic of the Sanders house, surveying his grim results. The Mexican had been the most difficult. He was heavy and strong, maybe more than he expected, and the voltage of the prod only slowed him down rather than bring him to a full stop. But in the end, a hammer, in the other hand, brought him to bear. Philip Bergman, for all his bravado, was mostly blustering noise. Drugs and greed had wasted his sensibilities beyond that of a simpleton, and the blade he held in his hand found a more suitable target in the midst of his own forehead. Now, the two of them lay in a heap on the old wooden work table high up in the Sanders attic, a blood trail from the dumbwaiter off to the side. Except for the bloody finger left at the back door, each of the dismembered malefactors lay collected together, mingled in death as they mingled in life with the conniving women. Lydia was still sitting at the wooden table when David returned that evening, freshly cleaned from his efforts in settling matters with his antagonists. He walked over to one of the walls and, reaching up, removed a cover from what appeared to be a pipe or tube going up into the ceiling, about a foot wide. When done, he tossed a canvas bag at his wife, who continued to sit silently, afraid so much as to utter a single word, the vision of those heads in his hands rendering her silent. In it were a change of clothes and more tins of food, along with her personal toiletries. Whenever you see this bag drop, take the contents out and put the bag back on the hook. If you don't, it will be the last you receive. David looked at her with not even a glimmer of love in his eyes. She had been planning her theft and his murder for months, yet there was the vow. For better or worse, and he'd keep his end of it whether she liked the consequences or not. With steel rods and concrete, David sealed the opening to the Sanders house from within the tunnel and shut the heavy wooden door granting access to the tunnel from the chamber and locked it tight. He looked at her as she sat, not believing he would leave her in such conditions. She had clean clothing, her personal effects, notebooks and pins, even her glasses to put them to good effect. Over time, he'd give her more things: light bulbs, scissors to cut her hair, even a bottle of booze on occasion to sedate her misery. What he gave her in his mind was a sentence of life instead of death. 2 weeks after the grisly discoveries in the Sanders house, a woman's body was fished out of Casco Bay by a lobsterman pulling traps off the Sound. She had been in the water for a couple days by appearances, and after an autopsy, it was determined that Rosalind Sanders had died of a drug overdose. How she got in the water remained a mystery, as well as where she had been the several days prior. Each of the cases remained open, and at one point Lieutenant Detective Simpson paid another visit to the Morehouse residence to inquire as to whether or not he had heard anything from his wife. Drug dealers is what we suspect happened. A deal gone bad or bad blood somewhere. Bergman had been identified as a local supplier down in the port, and the guess is the Sanders woman met a foul end on her part. The Hispanic fellow? Who knows? Simpson explained. Mrs. Morehouse family ever reach out? They might have heard something, although I suspect, given she's kin, they'd not be likely to share much. He added. David just shook his head, and with a bit more small talk, he bid his visitor to the door and took leave. He never talked with Simpson again. As the weeks wore on, David settled into a routine. Every few days he'd go out to the work shed between the two properties, and with a pallet jack move the heavy workbench and chest off to the side, removing the casement cover underneath. A canvas bag would then be dropped on the line to the concealed chamber below, where Lydia Morehouse would hastily remove the contents. Lydia tried screaming up through the portal the first couple of times, to David's amusement. It was merely a muffled scream up into the shed, and beyond it was little more than the shuffle of a black bird's foot. Seeing the bag dragged up before she could empty it stifled any further outbursts. Over time, he brought down more comforts: an actual bed and a side table with a couple more lamps, even a radio at one point. It would never be a place of comfort, but it wasn't consigned to a grave either, at least not yet. After 6 months had passed, the door chime sounded early one evening, and David made haste to answer the door for his expected guests. On the step was the familiar, wiry and stern-looking woman, and a rather attractive yet somewhat disheveled young lady a few years his junior. "How wonderful to see you. Please come in," David greeted his guests. Marjorie Allen had worked for David since he first opened shop several years earlier. He had worked for her father before he passed away, and leaving a widow and a daughter. She was several years his senior, but they shared a passion for literature and adventure. She was also his confidant, and with whom he shared his suspicions and discoveries. Clarice Allen, on the other hand, was a modern bohemian of sorts, and an authentic rogue, as well as Marjorie's niece. She knew people she shouldn't have, and after sorting out her juvenile years and early adulthood with stints in various lockups for a variety of crimes, mostly petty, she started running a place down in the port known for its rough veneer of life. Things could be bought with a price. After the minutiae and refreshments, David pushed a small passbook across the table to Marjorie and another one to Clarice. "You can Western Union out of the accounts at any time. Keep the transactions below $10,000 and all is good." Marjorie Allen broke her stern smile into a grin as they concluded their agreement, and with hugs and best wishes the parties went their way. She was retiring, and with Clarice they were heading to Corpus Christi for the warmer climes. Months turned into years, and Lydia Morehouse remained a prisoner, cared for by a husband living up to his bargain. For worse it was. She had been held down there behind granite walls for over 6 years by then, and the toll on what was left of her mind would tax even the most jaded of caretakers. She babbled to herself, mostly pacing the floor back and forth, morosely reflecting on her treachery and cause of confinement. Both souls were lost. Hers to the dim confinement and her treachery, and his to the perversity of his revenge, yet routine continued right up to the last moment of the vow. He was tired. Unusually so, and as he trudged out to the work shed with the bag in hand, David had to pause to catch his breath. With the sun high and warm, he was still cool or cold, and with a dry brow. The bench and chest had been left to the side for some time now, so all he had to do was remove the casement cover and lower the bag. He did, and peered down to see Lydia looking up at him with haunted eyes from the floor below. With eyes locked, the sharp searing pain struck center mass, and he clutched in quick agony before his body gave way with his face resting on the portal opening. Eyes still cast downward, yet now lifeless. Lydia shrieked at the disaster. The scenario had played out so many times in her tattered mind. What if he leaves and never comes back, or is killed, or just dies? Now it was her reality as she screamed up the portal, thinking it might awaken her husband, her captor. With the door to the work shed open and David dead on the floor, there was no longer any for better or for worse. There was just finality. As David's life slipped abruptly from him, 2,000 miles away, the now retired Captain Simpson sat in a Boeing 737 window seat heading back to Portland. He had picked up an anthology of Edgar Allan Poe's short stories, and settling on the cast of the Amontillado read through it and struggled with something that had always gnawed him about the Morehouse case, that sandy soil in the Morehouse garden several years earlier. That is an interesting collection of stories, isn't it? The flight attendant broke his train of thought. What an ingenious and cunning way to enact a revenge, even if the offense might have been imaginary, bricking his adversary up in a wall. What? Simpson asked. The story you were reading. It's about immurement, the Amontillado. I'm sorry. I was an English major in college with a study in literature. I was always fascinated with how macabre and nearly foolproof Montresor's designs had been. The attractive attendant smiled and continued on her way, and Simpson thought back on his troubles. He just couldn't put his finger on it until now. He had seen that same soil around the cellar wall in both the Morehouse and Sanders residences, and now he knew what it might have meant. After 6 years of toying with it in his mind, the obviousness of what he had missed was articulated with a startled gasp. He knew his next steps. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.